Hey guys, welcome back to our devotional in Ezra Nehemiah. We are in week 12, which means that we find ourselves this week in Nehemiah chapter 2, and in the Nehemiah portion of this book. And so, again, this is the continues to really follow this theme that things are not quite going the way that we had expected them to. So we see them go back to the promised land. We see a lot of division and rivalry occurring in that. And now, as Nehemiah steps into the picture, is this governor ruler who is going to help build a wall to protect the Israelites and their community and their temple. We see more and more problems and opposition arising. And so here in chapter 2, we see him go to King Artaxerxes and get permission to build the wall, although it seems like Artaxerxes is reluctant to do so. And so it seems that things are moving in the right direction again. But yet, once again, we are confronted with and encounter more and more opposition and problems. And so in verses 9 and 10 it says, "Then I came to the governors of the province beyond the river and gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent with me officers of the army and horsemen. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant heard this, it displeased them greatly that someone had come to seek the welfare of the people of Israel." So we're already getting a picture there that there is going to be opposition that we run into. We also see here in this chapter that Nehemiah, when he goes to inspect the current walls that he's going to seek to prepare, that they're not in great condition. And as that happens, as the passage closes, we see again this rivalry, this opposition coming up against an even more vivid and stronger way against the people of God. So as we go through that, as we reflect on something like that, it's like, like, what's the point? What use does this have for you and I today? As people who are not Israelites, as people who are living under the new covenant, which Christ has brought through his life, death, and resurrection. Why? What's the point in going back and looking at this? Well, what we see here is a really helpful picture of the way our God acts. And we've seen this throughout this whole series so far, but we see, again, a lot of really difficult things. We see a lot of really challenging things, and we see a lot of really, things that just bring up a lot of fear, a lot of, God, are you really going to help us? Are you really going to deliver us? Are you really going to fulfill your promises that you gave to your people? And we see the people in Nehemiah alike wrestling with that, wrestling with whether or not God was going to provide, wrestling with whether or not God was even active in their day-to-day life in the promised land they were returning from exile. And what we see is very similar to what happens when you try and grow something. You put a plant and you put a seed in the soil, and you have to wait. And even though you can't see anything happening, there is something happening under the surface, and there's growth that is occurring, and then you start to see it peak out, and then you start to see it eventually over however many weeks and months start to really flourish and thrive. And Jesus himself used that illustration in his own life and ministry in speaking of a mustard seed, that the kingdom of God is like this mustard seed that is this tiny little seed, the tiniest seed that his immediate audience was even aware of. And that seed then would actually grow into this great tree. And not only would it be this great tree, but it was a tree that would then house birds that from other places that could come and actually make their nests. And see, what Jesus is getting at there is similar to what we see here. We see this movement of the kingdom of God in the world that is often a movement that we don't see, is often a movement that we're not aware of. It is often a movement that it seems like to you and I that nothing actually is happening. But just like a seed, just like a mustard seed, as Jesus described, and just like what we see here described in the scriptures, and what we'll see continually throughout this book of Ezra and Nehemiah, is that even though we don't see anything from above the surface, there is a lot going on. Even though there may seem like there's very little growth, if any, there's a lot more going on. and that God's faithfulness is being demonstrated even in the little things, even in these, it's easy for us to get to the second half of this chapter and be like, oh man, look at this opposition. Oh man, this is terrible. Like, why would God allow this to happen? And we would completely forget the whole first part about Artaxerxes and about the fact that this foreign king who doesn't even belong to the people of God, actually being used by God himself to accomplish God's own purposes. See, God is faithful, and his faithfulness is demonstrated in the little things. And see, you and I, our tendency is to look to the very big picture things, the big things, but the problem with always doing that is we miss all of the little ways that God has been faithful in our lives, and we miss all of the little ways that God has been faithful throughout human history, as we see in the Bible, and we don't allow that then to speak to the way that you and I live in faithfulness to Christ here and now today. So my encouragement as we continue to go through this, as you read chapter 2 of Nehemiah, is to be reminded of that God's faithfulness is not always obvious, that God's action is not always obvious, but under the surface, he is working his master plan together, so to speak. He has been working throughout the course of history, and he continues to work today, bringing people to himself and growing people in faith in him. May that be a comfort and joy for us in this season that we find ourselves in. Thanks, guys.